In a former existence, at the brink of passing away, my sister had fervently implored me to look after her offspring. Helplessly, I found myself marrying my sister's husband and stepping into the role of their guardian. I dedicated myself entirely to their upbringing. Yet, instead of gratitude, I was perceived as someone scheming to appropriate their inheritance, fully exploiting my worth, and then watched unemotionally as I became ill and eventually died. As I took my final breaths, they even ridiculed me, claiming that someone as malevolent as I deserved such a destiny. In this incarnation, I refuse to tolerate such unfairness. I intend to live for myself and chase the life I truly want. At the workplace, Dr. M, wearing a sorrowful expression, informed us that the patient had limited time remaining and urged the family to stay by her side to fulfill her last wishes, ensuring she wouldn't leave with regrets. Upon hearing this, my mother began to weep softly. My sister's husband's eyes also welled up as he attempted to hold back his feelings. To any observer, it appeared as a loving, united family supporting one another. In my past life, I had naively believed the same. Back in the hospital room, my sister lay with her mother-in-law and two young children nearby. From their expressions, it was clear she understood her dire situation. My mother asked, "Ella, the doctor said you can go home tomorrow. Is there anything you'd like to eat? I can prepare it for you." Immediately, my sister broke down in tears. "What did the doctor say? Am I going to die?" Hearing the mention of death, the two children began to cry loudly, their sobs piercing the quiet of the hospital. My sister looked towards me, calling out my name through her tears. I moved closer, and she held my hand tightly, her voice shaking as she said, "Lily, I don't want to die. If I'm gone, what will happen to Alex and Mia? They're still so young. I can't find peace." I glanced at the fragile woman on the bed. She had been weakened by relentless cancer and extended chemotherapy. Her desperate gaze was unforgettable. In my previous life, it was on this very day that she had begged me to marry her husband and take care of her children. Initially, I was reluctant, but faced with her urgent pleas, advice from relatives, and the tears of the two kids, I yielded and consented. That choice led to a life filled with sorrow for me. In this life, having witnessed the ruthless nature of my sister's husband's family, I vowed never to let myself be ensnared in the same predicament again. I gently patted her hand, offering comfort. "Your husband is a kind man. He'll take good care of the children, plus there are still parents and many other relatives. You don't need to worry." My sister shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He's harsh and doesn't know how to care for the kids. Our parents are already elderly. I can't bear to see them struggle. Lily, I can only depend on you. For the sake of our sisterly bond over the years, you must help me." It was precisely because of our deep sisterly connection that I was present. I understood the anxieties of a parent constantly worried about their children's well-being. But why did it have to come at my expense? In my past life, I allowed her to continue her pleas, but in this life, I wouldn't permit it. That morning, I had resolved to arrive early to convince her to abandon this plan. Years ago, our parents had insisted that girls didn't require extensive education and should marry early to suitable partners. However, it was my sister who had firmly supported my pursuit of education even against our parents' wishes. No matter how cruel my brother-in-law's family had been in my past life, I couldn't entirely blame her. She had departed this world too soon, but the harsh reality remained unchanged. As I approached the hospital room door, I overheard my sister's mother-in-law saying, "Your sister is truly pitiable, but based on her behavior yesterday, once she dies, she definitely won't care about Alex and Mia anymore." My brother-in-law responded, "If she refuses to be my wife willingly, how can I take care of these two children? When the time comes, if I remarry, who knows how the stepmother will treat them?" My sister weakly suggested, "Let me persuade Lily one more time. She's always listened to me since she was young. I'm sure she'll agree." However, her voice lacked conviction. Her mother-in-law sneered, "Why waste time talking? I brought something effective from the countryside. It's a fertility drug for cows, extremely potent. If a person consumes it, no matter how strong-willed they are, they'll become promiscuous. By then, it'll be a done deal. How could she refuse to be your wife?" My brother-in-law laughed mockingly. "Mom, that's a brilliant idea." My sister hesitated, feeling it might be going too far. My brother-in-law coldly stated, "Sooner or later she'll be my wife anyway. What's the difference? If she doesn't want to, forget it. If the children suffer from a stepmother later, it's not my fault." My sister trembled and finally, through gritted teeth, agreed. "Fine, I agree." Standing outside the door, I listened to the entire conversation and felt a chill run through me. Without delay, I bought a bus ticket back to school. In my previous life, I had foolishly agreed to become a stepmother, only to be forced to drop out of school and return home to serve their family. Not being able to finish my education was my greatest regret. In this life, I would never let anyone obstruct my dreams again. In recent days, my sister's family had been persistently calling, claiming she didn't have much time left and wanting me to return to care for her. The sisterly bond from the past had been eroded by their selfish motives. What value did family affection hold? I genuinely had to thank them for revealing people's true nature repeatedly. While studying and juggling part-time jobs, I had recently taken on another job. I was fully aware that once my sister passed, they would undoubtedly try to force me into being a stepmother once more. When that moment arrived, I would refuse, and a relentless storm would follow. That day, after a long day of work, I was utterly exhausted, feeling like I might collapse. Just as I stood up after rearranging some items, dizziness overcame me, and I couldn't maintain my balance. At that moment, a strong hand grabbed my arm. I turned around to see a senior acquaintance. His eyes were filled with concern and pity. "Are you all right? Do you need to rest for a bit?" I forced a smile and shook my head. "It's nothing. I probably stood up too quickly." He looked at me for a moment before softly asking, "How dire is your financial situation that you have to juggle so many part-time jobs?" I forced another smile, attempting to conceal my exhaustion. In my past life, after I left them, he had traveled to my hometown to find me. When he discovered that I had dropped out of school to become a stepmother to my brother-in-law, he was deeply disappointed. Back then, he had advised me, "If it's just about money, I can lend you some. You don't need to sacrifice yourself like this." But I, being stubborn, believed that sacrificing for family was worthwhile. As he left, his face was marked with disappointment, heartache, and regret. Now, reflecting back, I wondered if he had ever had feelings for me. As he departed the supermarket, he turned and said, "Lily, if you ever find yourself in trouble, just come to me." I responded with a gentle smile, "Okay, this time, I won't refuse your kindness." News reached me that my sister was nearing her end. I checked the calendar. She would pass away the next afternoon. I booked a bus ticket for the afternoon, deliberately choosing a long journey to arrive as late as possible. I didn't want to give her a chance to make any last requests, nor did I want to face their cold, critical remarks about me being unfeeling. The funeral took place in my brother-in-law's hometown. Upon arrival, the mourning hall was already set up. I rushed to her coffin and burst into tears. "Sister, I'm here. Why didn't you wait for me a little longer? I'm sorry, it's all my fault. I couldn't get an earlier ticket. I didn't get to see you one last time. Rest assured, I'll take good care of our parents, Alex and Mia. Please find peace." Seeing me in such distress, the relatives approached to comfort me. Even my parents, who were initially displeased with my late arrival, couldn't say much and only looked at me with disapproval. I knelt beside Alex and Mia, burning incense while tears streamed down my face. It wasn't that I was overly sad, but the smoke from the incense made my eyes sting, and I couldn't help but cry. The two children couldn't endure the monotony and eventually ran off to play, but I remained kneeling all day. Anyone who saw me would commend the deep bond between sisters. That night, my sister's mother-in-law brought me a bowl of chicken soup, saying kindly, "Lily, take a break. You've been working hard all day. Don't overexert yourself. This is homemade chicken soup. Drink it to regain your strength." I accepted the bowl, pretending to want to drink it. Her eyes fixated on the bowl, her eagerness unmistakable. As expected, she had ulterior motives. I called Alex over and said, "Mia, this is chicken soup Grandma made. You're growing, so drink it to stay healthy." The child, excited at the mention of chicken soup, reached out to take it, but the grandmother quickly pushed his hand away. "This is for your aunt to nourish herself. Don't be rude." Alex pouted, on the verge of tears. I quickly comforted him. "Auntie loves Mia. Auntie will drink it all. Don't cry." As I brought the bowl closer, pretending to feed him, she snatched it away. The soup spilled, scalding my hand. I frowned, unable to hide my discomfort. Auntie, it's just a bowl of soup. If the child wants to drink it, let him. What's the big deal? My voice was loud enough for everyone in the morning hall to hear. Under everyone's gaze, she hastily made an excuse. It's not that I don't want him to drink it, but the soup is still hot. Let it cool first. Her plan had failed, and her displeasure was evident as she dragged Alex away. From a distance, I could still hear her muttering, "Drink, drink, drink." Just like her mother, lazy and greedy. Can't read the situation, always ruining things. Today was my sister's burial day. Over the past 2 days, I had been cautious not to eat or drink carelessly, fearing they might plot against me. After the funeral, I was completely drained from 2 days of insufficient sleep. My mother, seeing me staggering, worriedly said, "Go rest for a bit. I'll wake you up later." I nodded in agreement because I had to go to the gravesite that night to perform the rituals. While I was in a daze, I suddenly felt something heavy pressing down on me, making it difficult to breathe. Startled, I woke up to find a man in the dark pulling at my clothes. His heavy breath, smelling of alcohol, hit my face. I tried to scream, but before any sound could escape, a rough hand covered my mouth. Fear overwhelmed me. I struggled to push him away, but my strength was no match for his. The sound of fabric tearing echoed in the silent room. I forced myself to stay calm, suppressing my panic. His wet, disgusting kisses trailed down my neck, making me feel nauseous. My hand quietly reached for my pants pocket, where I remembered keeping some chili powder. The man seemed to think I had accepted my fate and lifted his head, preparing for the next move. Seizing the opportunity, I closed my eyes and threw the chili powder straight into his face. "Ah!" his painful scream echoed. The hand covering my mouth loosened. I sat up quickly, my eyes now adjusted to the darkness, and located his position. With all my strength, I kicked him hard in the groin. "Ah!" This time, his scream was filled with pain and humiliation. I swiftly adjusted my clothes, grabbed my phone, and ran outside, shouting, "Help! Someone help me! There's a bad guy!" My desperate cries drew the entire family and neighbors rushing out. My mother stepped forward, her face full of annoyance. "Lily, why are you making such a fuss?" I looked at her, my heart turning cold. I couldn't believe she didn't realize what had just happened, especially with my disheveled appearance and the fear and indignation on my face. It became clear that what my brother-in-law had done was with their implicit approval. I burst into tears, sobbing, "Mom, I was sleeping when a man came in. He tried to rape me." I didn't need to say more. Just by looking at my disheveled state, everyone understood what had transpired. Instead of defending me, my mother attempted to deny it. "This girl sleepwalks. There was no man in our house." I stiffened my voice and looked straight at her. "It's true. I threw chili powder in his eyes. He's still in the house. If you don't believe me, go check." The neighbors began murmuring. "This is no joke. Let's all go check. If there's really a bad guy, we should catch him and report him to the police." At that moment, my sister's mother-in-law hurried out, forcing a smile. "It's a misunderstanding. It was just Victor, my brother-in-law, trying to wake her up for dinner." I was stunned, my eyes filled with horror. "What? My brother-in-law? How could he?" Before I could finish, tears streamed down my face like broken pearls. "Mom, how could he do this? My sister just died." My mother couldn't handle it and cut me off abruptly. "I told you he was just waking you up. What are you thinking?" I looked down at my disheveled clothes, but before I could say more, my father roared, "Shut up. Are you trying to disgrace the family? Get inside now." With that, he lunged at me and slapped me hard across the face. The slap left half of my face numb and my vision blurred. My sister's mother-in-law stepped forward, grabbing my arm with a falsely gentle tone. "Lily, your sister just passed away. Don't make a scene. It's just a misunderstanding. Let's go inside and talk." I knew that no matter what excuses they offered, my earlier actions against my brother-in-law would not be forgiven. I struggled with all my might, shouting, "I'm not going in there. There's a bad guy. Help me, please." The neighbors looked at each other, unsure whose side to take since both parties were presenting completely different stories. My mother intervened, pulling me and declaring to everyone, "She's my biological daughter. Would I harm my own child?" Her sister had just died, and they were very close. She's probably just too emotional and a bit hysterical. The more I struggled, the harder they pulled me into the house. I knew that if I was dragged inside, something terrible awaited me. Just as I was about to be pulled through the door, a group of police officers in uniform pushed through the crowd and stepped forward. "What's going on here? Who called the police?" one officer asked. I immediately pushed everyone away and rushed to hug the leg of one officer, tears streaming down my face. "Please help me! There's a bad guy! He tried to rape me!" Seeing this, the police quickly began their investigation. My brother-in-law was dragged out of the house and taken away in a police car like a condemned criminal. Regardless of the final outcome, the image of the kind man he had built up over the years was completely shattered. At the police station, I was asked to provide a statement and undergo a medical examination. The marks of resistance and evidence on my body left him no room to deny it. Under pressure, he confessed to his intent to rape me and even revealed that the entire family had conspired to force me into becoming his wife. They were concerned I wouldn't agree, so they had planned to overpower me, ensuring I had no choice but to comply. When the truth emerged, the police officers looked at me with deep sympathy. What my family had done, especially my biological parents, was beyond their understanding. Despite being accustomed to their coldness and indifference, I still pretended to be in pain, tears streaming down my face. Both families were brought to the station, but they didn't stop cursing me. I just silently cried, neither resisting nor defending myself. When the investigation reached the mediation stage, my sister's mother-in-law shamelessly stated, "My son only drank a little. He didn't do anything. At most, he can marry her. What's the big deal?" The mediator couldn't hide his anger and coldly replied, "If your family isn't serious about mediation, we'll have him face criminal charges and go to jail." Hearing the word jail, my brother-in-law's family immediately panicked and quickly turned to persuade and threaten me. "If our son goes to jail, what will happen to Alex and Mia? You're their aunt. How can you be so heartless?" My mother also chimed in, sternly saying, "You have to tell the police to drop this. If you don't call me your mother anymore." In the end, the matter was settled on the condition that my brother-in-law publicly apologized to the entire village for his despicable plot. This also ended any hope they had of forcing me into becoming his wife. Additionally, I demanded $5,000 in compensation. Upon hearing about the money, the entire family erupted in curses. But when I explained that the money would be given to my parents as a filial duty, their attitude immediately changed. In reality, I didn't care about the money. I saw it merely as a price to buy my peace so they wouldn't bother me anymore. Returning to school, I vowed not to go home for a long time. As time passed, I entered my final year of university, busy with internships and preparing for graduate school exams. My relationship with Henry, the senior I knew, also became more stable. Over the past 2 years, I had always used the excuse of not having enough money for bus tickets to avoid going home. But this time, my parents seemed determined. They said if I didn't return, they would come to the school to find me. Fearing they might disrupt my studies, I decided to make the trip back. A neighbor had messaged me on social media saying that my brother-in-law had been frequently visiting my house recently. This only deepened my suspicion that they were plotting something. That evening, as Henry and I ate in the cafeteria, he noticed my unease. "What's wrong? You seem upset," he asked, placing a piece of my favorite rib into my bowl. I looked at him and softly said, "I'm planning to go back home tomorrow." He paused, his chopsticks hovering midair. "Why go back all of a sudden? I've never heard you mention it before." I hesitated, then said, "My parents called me back. There must be something going on." He frowned, his face filled with worry. "You're so busy right now. Can't it wait until summer break?" I shook my head. "I've already asked for leave. It's just that—" I hesitated for a moment, then added, "If I go back and can't contact you, please call the police for me." Hearing this, he immediately sat up straight, his face tense. "No way. If there's danger, I'm coming with you." My heart felt lighter. Perhaps having a reliable boyfriend like him was heaven's way of compensating me for the injustices I had endured. I returned home the next day. Knowing I was coming back, my parents had prepared a lavish meal, something rare in our household. Seeing this feast only confirmed my suspicion that they had a significant plan. As my mother served me food, she said with a tone full of concern, "It's been so long since you came home. Your father and I miss you so much. You've lost weight." It breaks my heart to see you like this. And I don't want to continue the charade of a loving family, I bluntly asked. School has been very busy lately. Why did you insist on calling me back? I need to return as soon as possible after this. My father immediately slammed his chopsticks on the table, his voice full of reproach. What kind of daughter are you? You've been studying for so many years, and what have you achieved? You've been away for so long, and now you want to leave right after coming back. Your mother and I are getting old. What can we rely on you for? He continued, his voice growing louder. Don't even think about leaving. You're over 20 now, a grown woman, and still not married. Your mother and I have found someone very suitable for you. Get married quickly and stay close so you can take care of us. I didn't argue, only inquiring about the suitor's background. I learned that the other family was willing to offer $200,000 as a bride price. They were in a hurry to secure me for $200,000. The next morning, the suitor's family arrived at our house. Finally, I met the suitable person my parents had chosen for me. He was short, nearly 220 pounds, with dull, lifeless eyes. His mother looked me up and down, her eyes appraising me like a piece of merchandise, then said disdainfully, "She's nothing like what the matchmaker described. With a body like this, she'll have a hard time bearing sons. My son is the only male heir in 3 generations. Marrying a wife is to have many grandsons to continue the family line. Once you enter our family, you must treat my son like heaven. Take good care of him. And of course, listen to me. I hate women who talk back. Your family only has 1 daughter. I'm not heartless. You can visit your parents in the future. But you can't take money from our family to give to them. Even the money you earn yourself must be spent on our family." I smiled calmly and said, "Why don't you let him state these demands himself?" Her face flushed with embarrassment. Then she added, "My son is shy. It's the same if I say it." "Really? Are you sure it's not because he's mentally disabled and can't speak for himself?" The day before, I had told Henry about this. He quickly looked into it and informed me that the suitor had suffered brain damage from a high fever as a child, leaving him with the mental capacity of a young child. Despite this, as the only son in the family, he was spoiled, rotten, and couldn't even take care of himself. Marrying him off was merely a way to get a free maid. The so-called good conditions were only because their family had received substantial compensation after their land was seized. Given their previous circumstances, they couldn't even afford the bride price for a woman of similar status. Hearing my words, her face turned red with anger. My son is just simple-minded. He's not an idiot. I turned to the stout man and asked, "What do you like to eat?" His face immediately lit up, his smile making his small eyes almost disappear. "Chicken legs. I want chicken legs." He was so eager that drool dripped from the corner of his mouth. I looked at my parents and coldly asked, "Is this the good person you chose for me?" Before they could react, I continued, "If you really want to marry me off, it's not impossible. You've raised me for so many years, and it's been hard. The bride price must be doubled, and since he's such a precious son, he can't live in a small town. We must buy a house in the city, at least 1,500 square feet, so we can bring you to the city to enjoy life later." Hearing this, my parents immediately saw the logic. Previously, they didn't know what kind of person he was, so they thought $200,000 was sufficient. But now, with the conditions I proposed, they completely agreed. His mother, however, was furious. "What, $300,000 for the bride price? And you want to double it? Do you think you're made of gold? With that amount, plenty of people would want to marry my son. And buying a house in the city? Dream on." With that, she dragged her son away, muttering as they left, "Chicken legs." "Mom, where are the chicken legs?" After they left, I turned to my parents and asked, "So, is it $200,000 or $300,000? My father angrily shouted, "That bastard Victor dared to lie to me. I'll go find him right now." After my father left, my mother seemed regretful about losing the $300,000 and tried to persuade me. "Lily, $300,000 is a lot of money. Even if he's a bit slow, he won't mistreat you. Marry him for a few years, and if it doesn't work out, you can divorce." I laughed coldly. "So, they plan to sell me off the first time, then divorce and sell me off again." But I emphasized, if I divorce after a few years and his family sues for the return of the bride price, what then? The law states that the bride price must be returned. My mother was stunned, then angrily said, "What? How can they ask for the money back? My precious daughter has been touched. I clenched my fists, trying to suppress the disgust in my heart. No matter what you think, the law is the law. Don't forget, someone almost went to jail because of this before. My mother pursed her lips, still muttering, "Whoever spends the money should return it." But I saw the hesitation in her eyes and continued to persuade her. "Mom, do you know how much a graduate from my school earns? At least $8,000 a month. That's $96,000 a year. In a few years, the salary will increase even more. My school even wants me to stay for a master's degree. With a master's degree, the starting salary will be $10,000. For someone from the countryside, $3,000 was already a lot. This amount was unimaginable. Not only that, if I have a master's degree, in a big city, the bride price from the groom's family would be at least $500,000. Moreover, my future is bright. I'll definitely be someone who can earn money, unlike a fool who would squander everything. The money I earn will only increase, while his family's money will only decrease. Mom, think about it." Hearing me outline this vision, she was clearly convinced. "It sounds good, but if you don't give me the money you earn, it's useless." I smiled gently. "Why wouldn't I? You're my mother. If I don't support you, you can sue me. You'll definitely win. Just ask around. I just wanted to buy time to graduate and stabilize my life. In a few years, even if they wanted to sue, apart from basic alimony, I wouldn't give them a single cent more." That evening, as I was booking a bus ticket back to school, my mother suddenly burst into my room, her face pale. "Lily, your father had an accident." On the way to the hospital, I learned that my father had been in a motorcycle crash that evening and was now in the emergency room. At the emergency room door, I saw traffic police and the driver who caused the accident. Fortunately, the driver was a private car owner, so at least the medical expenses could be covered by insurance. Otherwise, I didn't dare think about how much they would pressure me. As soon as my mother heard the news, she rushed at the driver, crying and shouting, "How dare you drive like that? Do you want to kill someone? My poor husband is the only breadwinner in the family. If something happens to him, how will I live?" The driver looked annoyed, but calmly replied, "Your husband was riding against traffic and crashed into my car. He's the one mainly at fault." But my mother didn't care about logic. "I don't care. You hit my husband, so you have to take responsibility. If he can't work anymore, you'll have to support our family." Finally, the traffic police had to pull her away to prevent her from causing a scene. After surgery, my father was moved to the ICU. Even if he survived, it would be a miracle. Sure enough, just 2 days later, he passed away. My mother seized this opportunity to demand $1 million in compensation from the driver. Of course, they refused. The hospital and surgery fees had already cost nearly $100,000, and that was the amount they were willing to pay out of humanitarian reasons. My father had been drinking while driving and was going against traffic, so the responsibility was entirely his. Seeing that the compensation issue could drag on, I told Henry to go back first. He wasn't comfortable leaving me alone, but I knew I couldn't let my mother discover his existence. In the end, the compensation was settled at $200,000. Of course, my mother wasn't satisfied, but the driver was firm. If they don't agree, they could take it to court. With my mother's elementary school education, arguing was difficult, let alone hiring a lawyer. Hearing that lawsuits cost money, she immediately abandoned the idea. At my father's funeral, my brother-in-law's family naturally attended. As soon as he saw me, he started mocking me. "Oh my, isn't this the little sister, the college student who hasn't visited her parents in years? Studying so much has made you lose all filial piety. Poor old man worked hard all his life and didn't get to enjoy any happiness before passing away." With that, he even pretended to wipe tears with his sleeve, though there were none on his face. I hadn't even dealt with his plan to marry me off to a fool, and now he dared to taunt me during my grief. I bit my lip, forcing myself to cry, then pointed at him and said, "How dare you show your face here? It's you. You killed my father." He was stunned, stammering. "What are you talking about? Your father had an accident. How is it related to me?" I lunged at him, grabbing his collar and shouting, "It's you! You introduced me to a fool. What were you thinking? You told the groom's family the bride price was $300,000, but told my parents it was only $200,000. You lied to my father, making him go to you to ask about it. It was on his way back from your house that the accident happened. You have to take responsibility." He tried to resist, but I didn't give him a chance. "My father drank at your house and you let him drive home. You didn't fulfill your responsibility. After my father's funeral, even if I had to borrow money, I'd sue you and make you pay." His mother, hearing this, immediately ran to protect her son. "Your father's death has nothing to do with us. Don't try to frame us." She was big and strong, and I couldn't fight her. I shouted, calling my mother. "Mom, his death is their responsibility," I shouted. "Mom, his death is their responsibility too. They have to compensate us. We can't let them off." Hearing the word compensation, my mother immediately changed her attitude and stood up to confront them. I grabbed my brother-in-law and wouldn't let go. His two children, seeing this, rushed over and started punching me. "You evil woman! You're bullying our dad. I'll beat you to death." I looked down at the two children, who had grown significantly since I last saw them. Seeing their punches ineffective, the older one opened his mouth to bite my leg. I lifted my leg and kicked him hard, making him fall to the ground and cry. My father-in-law, seeing me lay hands on his grandchildren, turned purple with rage and was about to charge at me. But luckily, the relatives attending the funeral stopped him. The chaos finally ended with the relatives mediating, but I had no intention of letting it go so easily. Before leaving, I looked straight at him and coldly said, "After my father's funeral, we'll settle this." After the funeral, a respected elder in the family came to see me. It turned out that my brother-in-law, Victor, was worried I would truly sue him and had asked someone to mediate. As soon as he sat down, he put on a remorseful face and spoke sincerely. "Uncles, aunts, I've been thinking a lot these past few days. My father-in-law's death is partly my responsibility. It's my fault for not stopping him, but I really didn't dare say much, fearing he wouldn't be pleased. I never thought things would turn out like this. If I had known, I would have done everything to prevent it." A few elders nodded, seeming to find his words reasonable. But if he thought a few words of regret would resolve everything, he was mistaken. I replied bluntly, "Do you think a few words of regret are enough? My father was the only breadwinner in the family. Now that he's gone, I'm still in school. How will my mother live? Who will take care of her?" My mother immediately joined in, her voice full of lament. "My life is so hard. First, I lost my daughter and now my husband. How will I live from now on?" Victor quickly stood up and approached my mother, putting on a filial act. "Mom, even though Chow is gone, I'm still your son-in-law. I've thought about it. Now that Dad's gone, Lily still has to study. You'll be lonely living alone. Why don't you come live with us? You're the grandmother of Alex and Mia, and your family is mine. I'll take good care of you." Hearing this, the elders nodded, thinking he was a filial and righteous person. My mother also seemed pleased. She thought living with her grandchildren, having someone to care for her, and with the compensation money from my father, she wouldn't have to worry. But I was different. Inside, I laughed coldly, but on the surface, I showed dissatisfaction. "No, I don't agree." My mother immediately retorted, "What right do you have to disagree? If I think it's reasonable, I'll do it." The elders also chimed in, "Lily, you're not even home. If Victor is willing to take care of your mother, it's a good thing. Don't make trouble." I bowed my head, pretending to be angry, but inside, I was overjoyed. I didn't care about my father's compensation, but if my mother insisted on following me, it would be troublesome. Now that Victor was willing to take her in, it was perfect. I looked forward to seeing how these two selfish and cruel people would cooperate. That night, I deliberately went to my mother's room to talk. "Mom, about Dad's compensation?" She immediately became alert. "What about it?" "This is my money. Don't even think about touching it." I smiled inwardly, my voice gentle. "What are you thinking? How could I dare touch your money? I just want to remind you that this is your personal money. Besides spending it on yourself, don't give it to anyone else. It's best to put it in a fixed deposit for higher interest." Returning to school, I continued to be busy with my studies. However, the incident of being forced to marry a fool made Henry constantly worry about me to the point where he even called his parents to meet me. The meeting went very smoothly. Perhaps he had warned them beforehand, as his parents didn't mention my family at all. They clearly stated that if we wanted to get married after graduation, they would buy a house where we worked to reduce our pressure. I had never envied other families' wealth and power, but I truly admired harmonious families where parents loved their children. When Henry's mother held my hand and asked about my studies and life, I almost nodded and agreed to marry him on the spot. But after calming down, I knew it wasn't the right time. Henry's family was well off. If my mother found out, she would definitely cling to them like a leech. My mother had only been living with Victor for a week when she started complaining to me over the phone. Initially, his family had agreed to take her in because they were eyeing the compensation money. But after living together, they discovered that my mother was extremely stingy. Not only did she refuse to spend any money on them, but she also declined to do any housework, spending her days eating and playing. Victor's mother became increasingly dissatisfied. They began picking fights with my mother, hoping she would leave on her own. But inviting a god is easy. Sending one away is hard. I also added fuel to the fire, advising my mother, just stay there. You have food to eat without having to do anything. Even if they scold you a few times, it won't cost you any flesh. My mother thought it made sense but couldn't stand being at a disadvantage. She started complaining everywhere about my father's death, how Victor had promised to take care of her, and how his mother treated her poorly. The rumors spread quickly, and Victor was criticized whenever he went out. Furious, he went home and argued with his mother. His mother, already resentful about having to support an extra person, became even angrier, causing the entire family to argue loudly every day. A year passed, and I received a call from my hometown saying that my mother had been beaten and that I needed to return immediately. When I arrived at the hospital, I asked for my mother's room and was given her medical report. Her condition wasn't serious, just some bruises and a cut on her forehead. But when I saw the blood test results, I was stunned. My mother had blood type B, and my father had blood type O, but I had blood type A. My hands trembled as I clutched the report, my heart feeling like it would burst. I ran to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to calm myself. The suspicions in my head could only be confirmed with more concrete evidence. Once I had calmed down, I wiped my face and adjusted my expression in the mirror before entering the hospital room. As soon as my mother saw me, she angrily threw a thermos at me. I dodged it. You still know how to come back. Useless. What's the point of raising you? If I had known, I would have thrown you into the pond to drown when you were a baby. Looking at her, I remembered everything she had done to me in both my past life and this one. I just wanted to grab her and force her to tell the truth. I forced myself to stay calm and asked softly, I'm here now. Who beat you? That bitch Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson was Victor's mother. It turned out that things had escalated to the point where the two women had gotten into a physical fight. Why did she beat you? Where's the rest of the family? Did they just leave you after beating you? My mother avoided my eyes and didn't say anything. Her silence only deepened my suspicions. I decided to go to Victor's house to uncover the truth. As soon as I arrived, before I could say anything, Mrs. Thompson pointed at me and started cursing. You shameless woman! How dare you show your face here? I'll tear you apart! I frowned and asked coldly, What do you mean by that? You beat my mother and still act like you're in the right. Mrs. Thompson angrily replied, So what if I beat her? That old hag dared to climb into my husband's bed. I should have beaten her to death. If you're so desperate for a man, at least look at yourself first. What kind of rotten fish are you? As she spoke, she pushed me out the door and slammed it in my face. From just a few sentences, I learned shocking news. My mother had climbed into Victor's father's bed and been beaten for it. How interesting. A few days later, I found a quiet place to cry my heart out. In my hand was the DNA test result confirming my suspicions. I wasn't their biological child. All the pain and resentment from 2 lifetimes vanished upon learning this truth. I felt fortunate not to be their real daughter. This meant I was no longer bound by the blood ties they had always used to control me. As for my biological parents, I didn't dare hope for much. I had read stories online about families who favored sons over daughters and were willing to abandon their daughters. If that was the case, I'd rather have no parents at all. After crying, I adjusted my emotions. All the suffering I had endured in 2 lifetimes finally required someone to pay the price. After completing the discharge procedures for my mother, I took her back to Victor's house. Mrs. Thompson stood blocking the door. refusing to let us in, and continuously spewing vulgar curses. I bluntly said, "We're being considerate of the children in the house, so we don't want to make a big scene. But if you continue with this attitude, I'll call the police. You beat my mother. That's intentional assault." Victor quickly ran out to stop his mother and invited us in. Not seeing his father, I asked, "Where's your dad? If you've done something wrong, hiding isn't what a man should do." Once everyone was present, I coldly said, "My mother and your father had an incident. How does your family plan to resolve this?" Mrs. Thompson jumped up in anger. "Your mother has no shame, and now you're demanding an explanation from us." I smiled mockingly. "Do you think your family has the right to decide everything? Let me make it clear. My mother was forced by your father." I signaled to my mother, who immediately burst into tears. Oh heavens, I have no face to live anymore. I've been bullied my whole life, beaten, and now falsely accused. I'll go to the police station and kill myself to let the law bring me justice. Seeing the panic on their faces, I pulled my mother up, pretending to leave. "Wait," Victor's father spoke up, his voice panicked. "It was consensual between me and her? How can you say it was forced?" I coldly looked at him. "You say it was consensual, but my mother says she was forced. The injuries on her body are evidence. By the way, this family has a record of attempted rape by your son. Like father. Like son. I think the police would be very interested in investigating." Hearing this, everyone's faces turned pale. Although the previous incident hadn't led to a conviction, being detained for a few days had left a lasting impression. Victor quickly apologized. "Mom, don't be angry. Let's talk this over. My mother has a hot temper. I apologize on her behalf. Please forgive her." Under my firmness and threats, they finally had to sign an agreement. The agreement clearly stated that they admitted Victor's father had forced himself on my mother and beaten her, and they promised to continue taking care of her and treating her well. As they signed and pressed their fingerprints, a look of relief appeared on their faces. I just smiled inwardly. What a bunch of fools. This time, I didn't leave in a hurry, but took the time to learn more about my origins through old neighbors and relatives. Simultaneously, I kept visiting Victor's house to stir up trouble, ensuring their family had no peace. One day, on my way back from their house, I caught Victor embracing a woman in a small alley. When I saw the woman's face, I couldn't help but smile. In my past life, this woman had been infamous throughout the region. She was a widow from a neighboring county with a young son. After remarrying, she had an affair with her father-in-law, while her husband was away working. In this life, she was involved with Victor. If they really got married, the upcoming drama would be incredibly entertaining. From the information I gathered, I learned that my biological parents had worked at a construction site in Guangzhou, and I had appeared when they returned home. At that time, I was only a few months old. No one knew more details. I told Henry everything, and he said he would help me investigate further. The day I was preparing to leave, my mother pulled me into the room to talk. It turned out that Victor had approached her to borrow money, and the amount he wanted was tens of thousands of dollars. I immediately wanted her to agree to lend him the money because if he married that widow, I would have a great show to enjoy. But I knew persuading my mother wasn't easy. An idea flashed in my mind, and I whispered my plan into her ear. My mother's eyes widened in shock. "Will this really work? Mrs. Thompson will definitely not agree." "Don't worry, Mom. If it succeeds, you'll go from being a guest to the host. If it doesn't, you won't lose anything." My plan aligned with her beliefs. In my mother's view, women ultimately had to rely on men to live well. That evening, when the whole family was gathered, my mother spoke up. "Victor, if you want to borrow money, it's not impossible." Victor's eyes lit up. "Mom, just tell me your conditions." "I'll do anything." My mother coldly replied, "Divorce your mother first, then marry me." "What, you shameless woman? Your husband is dead, and now you want to steal mine." Mrs. Thompson was so angry she wanted to tear my mother apart. My mother remained unfazed. I calmly added, "We can't say that. My sister is gone, and now my brother-in-law wants to remarry. Our family doesn't oppose it. But if you want to borrow money, with your family's current situation, how will you ever repay it? If my brother-in-law marries someone else, it will completely sever ties with our family. Do you really think my mother would marry a poor, old man?" Mrs. Thompson gritted her teeth. "Don't dream of taking my place." "Never." I smiled faintly. "Then forget it. My brother-in-law can stay single for life, remaining loyal to my sister and taking good care of the children." That's fine too. Victor really wanted to marry the widow, but forcing his parents to divorce was a difficult situation. He hesitated. My mother has sacrificed her whole life for the family. How can I do this to her for my own marriage? What kind of person would I be? He turned to my mother, his eyes pleading. Mom, you know how I feel about you. You're old now. I can't let you struggle anymore. I can't bear to make you work. If I remarry, at least there will be someone to help you take care of the children. I cut him off. Brother-in-law, my mother isn't heartless. Even if it's a divorce, it's only on paper. In reality, everyone will still live together as before. It's just a change in documents. Everything will remain the same. Hearing this, Victor began to ponder. I left to let the family discuss it among themselves. With my understanding of these people, I was sure they would agree. Sure enough, the next day, they nodded in agreement. It seemed they couldn't wait any longer. After my mother completed the marriage registration, I reminded her that she was now the mistress of the house and needed to be frugal. I even advised her to wash clothes by hand to save water and electricity. In the cold winter, Mom, remember to follow this. Seeing the hateful looks from my nieces and nephews, I just smiled. Without my guidance and support, with their average abilities, they would never have the chance to attend a prestigious university or get a good job. As for my niece, living in a family that favored sons over daughters, she would never be valued. In my past life, I had cared for her deeply, but in the end, I was betrayed. Now I would let them face a stepmother who was hard to predict. Not long after returning to school, Henry found information about my biological parents. Tomorrow will be the day I meet them. My heart was filled with nervousness and anticipation. Henry held my hand tightly and gently said, "No matter what happens tomorrow, I'll always be by your side." At the restaurant where we had arranged to meet, when I saw faces that resembled mine, I couldn't help but be moved. "I'm sorry, my daughter. I've lost you. I've wronged you so much." The woman who hugged me and cried was my biological mother. I was at a loss, not knowing how to react. The middle-aged man with red eyes silently shed tears. It was my father. Beside them was a couple around my age. The woman with eyes that looked so much like mine was my sister. After everyone had cried, we sat down to talk. My mother recounted how, when I was a few months old, she had taken me to the market in a stroller. In a moment of carelessness, I had been kidnapped. Over the years, they had spared no expense or effort to find me. To prove this, they brought old newspapers with missing child notices and online posts searching for relatives. Seeing this evidence, I couldn't hold back my tears. It turned out I wasn't an abandoned child. I was loved, and my parents truly cared for me. I had a warm family. How wonderful. Seeing me cry, they comforted me. Spending the day together helped ease some of the awkwardness. That night, my mother insisted on sleeping with me. She held me and told me about the day I was born, then cried. I cried with her. The next day, I returned home with my biological parents. Henry stayed by my side the entire time. The first thing we did upon arriving was go to the police station to report the case. Since I had been kidnapped as a child, the perpetrators needed to be brought to justice. After that, we returned to my family's home. My father had previously worked as a small construction contractor in Shenzhen. During the real estate boom, he had accumulated significant wealth. Looking at the 1,000-square-meter villa, Henry whispered in my ear, "From now on, I'll just rely on you." "Don't worry, I promise I won't be a freeloader." I gave him a reproachful glance. Relatives came to welcome me, each bringing gifts. When they learned I had brought a boyfriend, they joked that his gift would come later. My sister, 5 years older than me, was already married with a 3-year-old daughter. The little girl, soft and adorable, hugged my leg and said, "Auntie, welcome home. I'll give you all my candy." As for my adoptive parents, they had been arrested and confessed to everything. That year, they had gone out to work. My adoptive father had worked at my biological father's construction site, but was fired for laziness. He held a grudge against my father. When he happened to see my mother taking me out, they kidnapped me, both to seek revenge and because of the gold bracelet I was wearing, which had sparked their greed. Initially, they had planned to sell me to another family, but the trafficker they had negotiated with was arrested. Afraid of being implicated, they had no choice but to take me back to their hometown, claiming I was their biological child. My adoptive mother was sentenced to 3 years in prison and had to compensate my family tens of thousands of dollars. Unable to pay, this debt became the shared responsibility of her family, including her new husband, Victor's father. The story of a mother in law marrying her son in law's father became a hot topic of discussion in the village. People didn't know whether to call my niece's grandmother or aunt anymore. While I was busy preparing for my wedding with Henry, my biological parents were still furious about what my adoptive family had done to me. They kept spending money to make that family's life increasingly chaotic. After my adoptive mother was released from prison, the family began blaming each other, arguing, and even fighting. By then, I was a few months pregnant. My mother-in-law and biological mother took care of me so attentively that they were even afraid I might fall while going to the bathroom. I had a loving family, a husband who adored me, and was about to welcome a lovely child. This life was enough for me,